Yeah, you have control now, Niall, so start whenever you want, Tom.
Very good. Uh, I'm delighted to welcome today's presenter. Niall O'Donnellan is an independent strategy advisor, mentor, and developmental economist. He's a senior research associate with the Centre for Cross-Border Studies. He's worked in a range of roles in economic development, both in industrial and enterprise development, and in education and training. And he holds a master's in economics from the University of Galway. And just to say before we begin that there will be one more event before the end of the year, which will be the 12th annual Donal Nevin lecture, which will be taking place in the Royal Irish Academy on the 5th of December at 6 p.m., where Professor Mary Murphy will present on a new all-island social settlement, an eco-social future of care and equality, with Dr. Larry O'Connell Nesk as the respondent. The lecture will be followed by the book launch of Studies, an Irish Quarterly Review. So we're going to have a talk here today on regional aspects of sectoral clustering and innovation development across the island of Ireland. We're very lucky to have it. It's a fascinating topic, and given the events of today in the United States, our indigenous capacity, north and south of the border, to generate productivity within our own borders and internally, and the importance of clustering will be all that much more important. So we'll have a presentation for somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes, I think. And after that, we'll have a question and answer session. And just to say, our intention here is to record the entirety of it, both the presentation and the question and answer section afterwards. But if people want to hide their camera or stay out of the conversation on that basis, by all means do so. So with that, I will hand it over. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Tom, and thanks to NERI for the invitation to share themes of accelerating growth, our project under the auspices of the Centre for Cross-Border Studies. It's an honour to be asked to contribute, especially as I actually once was privileged to meet Donal Nevin very briefly decades ago as a recent raw IDA recruit. I was sent down to bring him up to the boardroom where he was making a presentation, and outside, we were a bit early, he sat down. After a few pleasantries and I gave him a glass of water, he took out of his satchel a copy of the CSO's quarterly statistical journal, which, as we all know, in those pre-digital days, was a hard copy. And then he started to browse through the data and actually, with a pencil, mark the figures and trends that he thought were interesting. And it made a big impression on me. About the importance of immersion in the raw data and browsing through it and kind of seeing what might come up and so on. And certainly a lesson I built into my own practice and indeed is a basis for the work that I'm now about to share. So what we're going to focus on is just clicking the okay.
Just click on the screen now.
Or just click on the screen. So sorry, apologies. Okay, perfect. So what we're going to focus on is 6 questions in terms of the regional aspects of sectoral and innovation development. And the first we're going to talk about is what is balanced regional development and growth. So if we look at the regions on the island of Ireland, we're talking about 4 NUTS 2 regions. 3 in the Republic and the other in Northern Ireland in the UK. And when we look at actually the trends in terms of population on the island of Ireland over the last 200 years, we basically see pre-famine there were 8 million people on the island of Ireland. And the projection up to 2040 is that figure will re-emerge as 8 million. That's driven by the East Mid region basically driving and recovering its pre-famine figure in the mid-70s, and by Northern Ireland also recovering its pre-famine figure in the 90s. When we look at the region that's of particular interest and focus in this discussion, the work that I'm involved in, the Northern Western region, we see that the share of that region in terms of population, about a third in the 1840s, 200 years later, will be in the order of about 18-17%. That's kind of been a slide, if you like, through the century and a half up to 2000, and then kind of stabilized over the period, the first 20 years or so, and then a slight, somewhat of a dip. Now, obviously, that region has also got challenges in terms of income generation, productivity, structure of population in terms of percentage of dependency, and so on. So, to the extent that, from a European Union point of view, it's defined as a lagging region. And it's a region in transition, which uniquely is a region in transition. So then the question becomes, from a policy point of view, the National Planning Framework draft basically talks about turning around this region to better achieve its potential. And when we're talking about turns around, obviously population growth, the increase of 150,000 over the next 20 years is projected, is the key driver. But to actually make that happen, to actually have people come to the region and stay in the region, employment creation is the key driver and the key focus, if you want, in terms of what needs to happen. And in terms of the scale, it's roughly half of the population growth would need to be in net employment creation. And this is a busy slide, but basically it's the NESC study of FDI across the regions. And what it basically is saying, what Chris Van Eggerath and his team are saying, is that actually employment is concentrating increasingly, and particularly in the agency-supported firms. So by 22, Dublin accounted for nearly half of foreign firm employment. And that trend, given the absence of a stronger policy intervention and the light of the current regional industrial structures, that trend will be of further divergence, further concentration. So this is at least an orange, if not a red flag, for employment creation in the Northern Western region. The OECD's view of the region is that whilst it might be strong on natural capital and the environment and so tourism, it's weak. It's in the red, but the Northern Western region is marked here in the red, is weak compared to both the Republic and also the European Union in a range of factors driving regional growth. The Northern Region Western Region Assembly itself and its region spatial and economic strategy highlights the fact that actually its transport infrastructure is actually one of the lowest in the European Union, over 200 and also 2 regions. It's actually on par with Bulgaria and places like that. Their analysis, particularly John Daly's analysis, particularly shows that the region received about 10% of the Republic's investment in infrastructure, which is lower than its 18% share of population. And this is one of the most analytical works done on the construction industry, as you can see, over a period of 50 years, which basically tries to understand, is there potential for changes in the pattern of development? And it concludes rather skeptically, if you like, that actually only if there's effective ways of bringing these about, which is very challenging in a market private enterprise economy. And without strong interventions, it's very unlikely to happen. So this all gives concern and challenges in terms of the Northern Western region. What this is here is the European Commission ranks regional ecosystems, and this scores. And what this is what the Republic of Ireland and the UK's region scores according to the European Union in terms of its competitiveness, in both 2021 and in 2017. And the one on the right is the Northern Western region. As you can see, it's the lowest. Even more interestingly, it is actually declining over the period 17 to 21. The black bar at the top shows you the level in 2017, and the green underneath it is actually in 2021. That's in contrast to European average in terms of its regions, where it actually has shown a strong growth. The black bar above the black bar shows the growth between 2017 and 21 for the averages of the European Union regions. On the island, if we look at the green, we're looking at the middle, the eastern middle region, which is obviously the strongest in the Republic, and also then followed by the southern region. But what we also see is actually in both regions, they're actually declining in their competitiveness compared to in 17. So the 2017 bar, if you like, is above the 2021 performance. The only region of the island of Ireland that actually is improving its performance from this perspective is actually Northern Ireland, and it has actually gained significantly over those 4 years. Over the rest of the UK, you see all regions either static or actually making gains, particularly in Wales. So this, if you like, is a kind of a backdrop to the challenge in terms of how can we actually ensure population growth driven by employment growth to actually ensure the region at least maintains its share, if not balance population as well as employment and income and so on. So it's critical that we look at what are the drivers. And the key driver, actually, this is from the NESC study, again, for 2023. And again, Chris Van Egert and his team concluded that this is a central conclusion for regional growth. It's the sector mix per se, more than nationality mix, i.e. IDA or EI or overseas or indigenous companies, which is the main impact on regional growth performance in terms of employment. And this leads us into the next theme, if you like, and question, which is what is sectoral clustering and does it matter? In a sense, we already shared that, yes, it does matter, but we need to understand what is it and how we influence it. So just what is sectoral clustering? And you hear sectoral clustering talked about a lot, but actually with a lot of different meanings. But really, there are three meanings that we need to understand. First of all, a concentration where you have a spatial grouping of companies in a particular locality, and they're just a statistically group of companies located in the same place. There's no connection of note between them as such, and there's no great policy focus on them. The second conglomeration is where same kind of statistical spatial grouping of companies with few close connections, but now policy has a very strong focus on them, and you see basically sector-specific investment in education, training, services for that sector. For example, University of Galway pivoting towards medtech as a core of its educational offer about 10 years ago. That's a classic move under conglomeration. And then finally, then a small number of companies, typically in these clusters, may do joint business development. Again, our interest here is particularly in the conglomeration, concentration, conglomeration definitions, if you like, okay, and how concentrated clusters evolve into conglomerations. Okay. So when we look at the European Union study of clusters, they identify a full range of clusters right throughout and beyond the European Union, including the UK, and they conclude. The really strong conclusion is that clusters, companies in clusters, on average have 25% higher productivity. And this is a strong underlying logic as to why we should have an interest in clusters. More highly clustered, the higher the productivity and therefore the higher income in the region. So it's a core underlying driver of regional growth. Ireland, as in the island of Ireland, according to this study also has 40 clusters, about half of them in the Eastern Midlands region, and then 11 in Northern Ireland, 8 in the Southern region, and up to 4 in the Northern and Western region. And then when we, again, just standing back on trying to understand what clustering do we have on the island of Ireland, we need to understand that actually within each sector globally, there tends to be globally influential hubs. So for ICT, you'll have Silicon Valley, Cambridge and Boston, life sciences, and so on. And that there then are a range of and networks of significant spokes to such global hubs, right through that feed into Colorado, and other areas feeding into Silicon Valley and so on, or Denver feeding into Silicon Valley, and so on. So this is the structure globally. And the question for the island of Ireland is, okay, first of all, we do not have any global leading hubs, despite some of the languages sometimes here. We have potentially, and in practice sometimes, significant spokes to such global hubs. And the strategic question we have is, how do we strengthen such sector clusters that we do have and that we can have that's within grasp, so they are both in global perception and in reality growing significant spokes to those globally leading hubs we talked about before. And when we look at, say, life sciences as an example, we're looking here at the island of Ireland, and obviously there's the hubs that we talked about in terms of Boston, Cleveland, the triangle around Oxford and Cambridge and London in terms of life sciences here. And then, of course, Germany, where you've got southern Germany in particular, which is strong in terms of medtech and pharma, and is a significant hub, as well as obviously Singapore as well. So from an island of Ireland perspective, this is a one perception of the clusters, top clusters in terms of UK and Europe. Okay, and what's clear is we have Cambridge, which is obviously a strong hub. We have southern Germany, Munich and Baden and so on. And we also off map, obviously, at Boston. And we also have some global spokes here. We have Copenhagen, and indeed it's a shared Swedish, Danish cross-border hub, if you like, or not a hub, but a spoke into the global hubs in the life sciences industry, Paris also. What's missing, of course, with the absence is obvious here, which is basically that there is, in their perception of this particular organization, there is not a top life science cluster on the island of Ireland. And that is a challenge. And there are, of course, other lists that you can look at. Parts of Ireland, the island of Ireland do appear, but actually it's very much there's not a strong perception that the island of Ireland is a very strong life sciences cluster as a general comment. So the question then becomes, so how can we progress this? And when we look at the island of Ireland, we see 4 in each region, one very strong. So in the northern western region, Galway City in particular, we see medtech, very strong. We see in Cork, also in Limerick and Waterford, very strong in terms of scale pharma and chemicals. We see in Dublin, speciality pharma, particularly with some digital aspects to it, and so on, and obviously some really strong clinical trials and so forth. And then in Northern Ireland, we see really deep expertise in diagnostics. So we actually have 4 components, 4 parts that are in themselves strong in capability and internationally well respected, and lots of interaction and trade and exports and all that. Okay, but what the question is the potential to bring these together and build synergies through, for example, connected health, digitalization, and other aspects, personalized medicine, so that the whole of this that it becomes a whole of the sophisticated life sciences, which is a global spoke, which is more than the sum of the 4 highly competitive parts. So the whole is more than the sum of the parts. That's the challenge, and that's the opportunity, and it's the challenge. And that then shapes and evolves a global spoke that can actually be seen as internationally and recognized internationally as connected into the global hubs in the life sciences sector. So that's kind of, and then the context of policy is that we need to see that there's a number of interlinked and moving parts that make up the whole of a system of cluster development. And there's various elements such as the broad significant spoke we just talked about, the components of that, diagnostics, for example, the development at regional level of sectoral, of the parts that, in terms of medtech and Galway, deepening that, and also the linkages between universities and the companies, and also that some companies might be doing some shared business development. So these are all moving parts, but they all come together into a whole of a system of cluster development. Within the both jurisdictions, there is been a focus on sectoral priorities and various sectors identified as priority. And that evolves or can evolve into if like a shared view of what are the key sectors to focus on to progress as global sectoral spokes, if you like, that can feed into global hubs in life sciences, software, digital businesses, production engineering, agri-food, and so on. And so we move to the regional dimension. In a sense, we've already touched on it. But so what we're looking at here is that actually there is obviously a regional dimension to sectoral development. In most regions, in most sectors, there is a strong regional presence in one region, as we've already seen, medtech in Galway, and in other regions, there's other parts of the sector. So there's parts of a sector that are actually in each of the regions. And then there's opportunities to build on the synergies and linkages within the sector between the regions, and so making the whole greater than the parts, and with the shared sector-specific investments and networks and so on. Example of that would be shared island, shared research agenda and program, which has put in significant funding into some linking networks in terms of both life sciences and in the Northern Western region, there's also some key sectors been identified through the smart specialization exercise by the process by the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, and that is evolving now through discussion within the region into a shared portfolio, if you like, of the existing sectors that we're currently strong on, but we need to transform and convert into higher levels of performance, and then the emerging sectors that we need to create and attract that are, within grasp, they're near in terms of availability, in terms of what's available within the region. And so for each of these sectors within the region, we need to do, if you like, a deep dive into each sector and to see what is the next steps that would actually build this sector within this region, and therefore become a part that can contribute to a whole specialist hub on the island. And the key to that is filling out and building up the regional sector enterprise ecosystem, sector by sector within each region. So this is an example of, it's a map, if you like, of medtech in the Northern Western region. As you can see, what we have here primarily is the group of companies. It's some large companies, overseas companies, some large companies that have come out of the Irish pool of companies, some existing international Irish origin companies such as Aerogen, a range of depth of innovative SMEs, scaling companies, and a range of micro businesses in a whole range of specialist areas. And then obviously the whole spin-outs coming out of University of Galway and so forth. So this is, if you like, the company structure. And again, we need to understand at a granular level the company structure. It's not just medtech companies. It's actually companies that play different roles within that sector, within that region. And then there's obviously a SWOT that we can do. In this case, digitalization or challenges, supply talent or challenges, and so forth. And then there's an action in terms of the drivers and the levers that we can use the development plan for this sector in this region, medtech in the Northwestern region. And in that particular case, we're talking about some wet labs, talking about building up the supplier network, strengthening Curim, which is the SFI tech center for medtech, linkages within the region, and then some more interdisciplinary work, particularly digitalization with Insight, working more closely with Curim and so on. So this is all granular, what could be called the knitting that needs to be done at a regional level to develop a sector in that region and to progress it up to a higher level of performance. To do that involves a lot of players. This is a map, if you want, of the players that are involved in the enterprise space within the Republic of Ireland and within particularly the Northern Western region. And as you can see, there's a lot of people, bodies working at different levels, different specific roles, and reporting, particularly important, reporting into different departments. So what this needs is to drive regional development. This needs we need to come together and focus on a series of shared goals, shared implementation program, and so on in the different areas of responsibility and delivery. And that involves a polycentric approach in terms of working across silos and also up and down different levels. And for those who I know maybe join us who are really interested in this work in theory as well as in practice, I would recommend or point out that we're actually learning from Elinor Ostrom, who is the first female Nobel Economics Prize winner, and her work on how administrative systems and community systems actually work together across silos and up and down between different levels. And this is really the key to actually making the regional development work, which I have talked about earlier, work. And obviously, it needs to be understood and supported by, and indeed participated in, by the centre as well as the bodies within the region, by the central bodies as well as the bodies within the region. Obviously, funding is important in both jurisdictions. There's significant funding aimed at regional development, and there's indeed lessons that can be learned from both models, if you like, that are various models involved that are there. So moving to the third question, or sorry, the next question, which is the regional dimension in innovation. And if we look at the Republic of Ireland, its key policy on innovation, Impact 2030, its key deliverable metric, if you like, is in the area of total researcher staff as a percentage of the total in private sector employment. And what we're looking at here is that the target is set at going from 10 per thousand to 15 per thousand, i.e. going from 1% to 1.5%. And as you can see, Ireland is basically progressing to some extent, but has stalled actually in recent years. More relevantly from this discussion is actually looking at the spread of research staff. This is in private sector now, okay? The headcount in research staff, both PhD researchers, other researchers, technicians, and support staff. And we see, bottom of the page there, all islands, over 50,000 such research staff on the island. There's 22,000, over 22,000 in the eastern region. There's just under 19,000 in Northern Ireland. There's just under 7,000 in southern region, and there's 3,500, just over 3,500 in northern western region. And the key question is, okay, so how does that shape up against the target, if you like, of 1% or 1.5%? And what we see is that Eastern Midland region is 2%, Northern Ireland is 2%, and then the other two regions, Southern region and Northern Western region, are 1%. Indeed, in the Northern Western region, we're actually seeing a decrease in the actual number of absolute staff involved in private sector R&D staff members. So this is clearly challenging from the point of view of the Northern Western region in particular, because this is about future jobs. This is about research leading to future jobs in different ways. And so it's an important and key challenge that we have in this region, or in the Northern Western region. So to look at the academic side, we've just been talking about the business side now. Look at the academic side, we again see quite intensive concentration. This is so there's about 100 subject areas in the academic universities in both Republic and Northern Ireland that actually have made the top 200 global lists, if you like, according to QS back in 2021, I think. And as we see, 70 of them are in the East Mid region, driven particularly by Trinity and UCD. And then there are Northern Ireland's 14, particularly in Queen's, and then Southern Region 11, and UCC in particular, and then Northwestern region has 3, which is in University of Galway. And then last, just to comment on the other aspect of innovation, again, a key aspect of the enterprise structure in any region is the percentage of employment that actually are in this micros and smaller businesses. By smaller businesses, I mean companies that are employing less than 20 people. So self-employed, micros up to 10 and less than 20 people. Over the whole Republic, they are basically 1 in 3 private sector employees outside of farmers are actually employed in this category of companies. So it's very significant. It's hugely significant in the Northwest region, particularly as you go outside Galway City and up towards up towards Mayo and the rest of the Northwest and indeed the border counties. It's nearly half of the private sector employees are actually involved in these smaller companies. And typically they tend to, they vary in terms of productivity and innovation, but typically tend to be lower in terms of innovation, lower in terms of productivity and so on. But the interesting question and challenge is, can we actually increase the productivity and innovation levels of these companies? And actually, there's 2 studies, the one from Queen's, which talks about the relationship between innovation investment in these companies and productivity, and it sees a positive relationship. In other words, if you do invest in their innovation capability, they do increase productivity, which is obviously both important and reassuring. And second of all, I'm not sure if you can see it in the screen here, but second of all, there is the McKinsey report, which basically talks about the potential of investing in small companies, so that you increase innovation and productivity, and that has a particularly important add-on to GDP in emerging economies, but even in developed economies of 2 to 5% or whatever it is. Bottom line is, this is a critical part of the innovation and business structure that is rarely particularly focused on from a policy point of view, or not in the, it has a focus obviously from a policy point of view, but has it got the high enough focus from a policy point of view might be the key question in the context of both their presence and also in terms of their possible impact. So what can our place do to actually improve our growth? And to paraphrase John Donne, no place is an island, and all places are connected with each other, and scale and proximity do matter. So if we look at one location, picking out Sligo, as in all communities, the question is, what does this all mean for our community? And so let's just looking at Sligo, we have to look to understand that. Answer to that question is, how do we progress our growth, if you like, given all the various factors we talked about? There are 3 questions we need to ask: is where's our place in the global sector value chains we just talked about? Where's our place in this global spatial hierarchy? And what's the practical strategic actions our place can do? What agency power do we have to make that happen? And so in the case of Sligo, there is, if you look at the sectors that Sligo town and county have, and there's regional hubs, so it includes Leitrim and some other parts. Basically, you're looking at some key sectors that we already have and some emerging sectors that we could have. So that's, if you like, an agenda. That's where we fit, if you like, on the global sector value chain, and that's the kind of thing we could actually improve it. Obviously reinforced by the skills required for that, both in a specific sense in terms of engineering, but also more basic AI and so forth, but also reinforced and built on a lifelong learning and nurturing culture, which is essential in terms of developing skills and people capable of the various levels of skills we need. In terms then of where's our place in the global spatial hierarchy, obviously this is a hierarchy. It goes from large global cities right down to islands and so on, and each place has its role in terms of interaction with each different levels and with each other, and a particular contribution to the services in the region, so, broadly, and economies and so on, and globally. And Sligo is bigger regional town. It's got 20,000 population roughly, like Enniskillen and Omagh, Cavan as the equivalent towns, if you like, in the region. And then the question is, how do we build and leverage that scale through spatial linkages and alliances? And in the case of Sligo, under Project 2040, it's been identified as a Sligo Regional Growth Hub. And that is, when we're talking about that, we mean Sligo town, 20,000 people, Sligo counties, 80,000 people, and Leitrim, and then the southern Donegal, below the Barron Gap, and then some of North Mayo and some of North Roscommon. And so that is, if you like, is starting to, if you like, leverage scale. But actually, when you look at, for example, the 2013 Northern Ireland Regional Development Strategy, they talk about links potential between Enniskillen and Sligo. And so we have the seed of what could be called, connections and potential cooperations between the Sligo Growth Hub and Fermanagh Oma as the ingredients, if you want, for a northwest mid-lower region. And that, if you like, allows a scale, a much more significant scale of nearly 250,000 people that can avail of scale economies, networks, and synergies. So it's actually able to add to the overall whole, if you like, in terms of economic activity and therefore jobs and so forth, and also avoid being out of sight and out of mind from a policy point of view. The rail review is a question and point. We're both sides of in both jurisdictions, these parts of the northwest, mid-lower northwest, were left off the list to support and boost mutual economic and social growth. And then the last question for any place is, well, what control do we have? Is it not all going to be decided in Belfast, in Dublin, in London, in Brussels? And actually, obviously, there's different levels of agency we have. We have control over certain things, our values of pride and our place and so forth, our ability to work together, openness to external interactions, and our ability to develop strategy together. We've leverage in terms of being able to spend on, say, smaller enterprises, or develop the local education system, and also accessing networks such as the larger companies, SME networks, and so forth. We can educate in terms of leadership training. We can influence, obviously, in terms of getting other bodies to provide investment, lobbying, and so forth. And that's a key part of most regions. And obviously support policies and trends that benefit the region. Remote working is an example and point. And then learn from what's happening on a global scale, understand it, and learn from it in terms of opportunities and challenges. So the last question then is, what might be emerging as a spatial network on the island of Ireland? And this leads us back to the sectoral clustering and the analysis of that, and the OECD, or the European Union analysis of that, and looking at the 3,000 clusters. What they see is that population size matters, okay, up to a point. And as the population of a particular region grows, or is bigger and bigger, there's actually more clusters. So it allows, it's a synergy, and it allows greater levels of productivity, greater levels of income, and so forth. But actually, that plateaus roughly at about 2 million people. So taking that 2 million broadly people, the question becomes, what does that mean for the island of Ireland? And already the answer is kind of given in the National Planning Framework, where they talk about Dublin Mid-East as the metropolitan zone, if you want, in the east, which is clearly significant and growing, and central. It's the one global, even though it's a small global city, we do have, it is a global city. And then on the other side, if you like, of the island, we have Cork, Limerick, Galway, and Waterford, and they are separate cities, but there's also potential for connections between them and so on, okay? And then the opportunity, though, is, can that connections be deepened and built into a more integrated Atlantic urban arc? This is the vision that John Moran, current mayor of Limerick, first elected mayor of Limerick, and indeed former Secretary General of the Department of Finance, has actually been positioning and declaring. That, of course, is great for those people most living in the south of the island, but below the Dublin-Galway line. But then the question is, well, what about the rest of us who are in the northern part of the island, northern western region, and in Northern Ireland? And the question then is there a potential for a third city region, which basically links together Belfast and its metropolis? Derry, Donegal is emerging as a northwest city region, and the other key cities such as Sligo and Enniskillen and Oma, and obviously the other areas, Dundalk and Newry and so on. But this is a potential. It may or may not evolve, but the question is it potentially possible? And if it is this what we're looking at when we talk about a balanced regional development across the island of Ireland? We certainly are seeing already the great metropolis of Dublin that's existing, potentially emerging, or emerging is Waterford, Cork, Limerick, Galway is a counterbalance to that. And then possible potential is the third northern network, I would put it, as distinct from an actual conglomeration. So that kind of concludes the presentation. It's about accelerating growth in terms of understanding the drivers of growth. Direction of travel is, if you like, looking at an overall series of levers that include targeting selected sectors. We just talked in detail about that. Understanding the range of individual businesses. Already, it's another aspect of it. Obviously, understanding, ensuring a competitive business environment. There's a lot of work done on that to the various bodies at regional and at jurisdiction level. Invest in local innovation and for prioritizing innovation really is a critical part of it. That's, if you like, also needs to be further and more deeply understood. And last, but by absolutely no means least, progressive best-in-class lifelong learning and nurturing system. We must understand that the OECD's skills scoreboard rates both the Republic and Northern Ireland as average in terms of its skills systems compared to Finland and Sweden and New Zealand, which are best in class. So this is a major need to understand more and to do more about. So last but by no means least, then, underpinning all of this, the human factor. And this is actually the Nordic, written by Lenny Rachel Anderson, Thomas Bergman. This is the Nordic secret about what exactly actually is behind the success of the 4 Nordic countries. And we all know in any league you look at, it's key to actually driving growth. And this is an important part of understanding the whole platform. So there you go. So that's the conclusion. Happy to take questions or comments.
Thanks so much. That was a tour de force. An overwhelming amount.
Sorry, we've gone over time. My apologies.
No,
Oh, yeah.
no, you're all good. You're all good. It was very, very interesting, and it kind of sets the table for us in terms of the challenge that's out there in terms of understanding what we're trying to achieve, and certainly that second last slide you have in terms of the key ingredients that are required. I was taken by your focus on Sligo at one point, and then moving it on up to a network of looking at the north and west, but including Belfast within that. I'm curious though, in terms of who or what institution or individuals at what level, in terms of what capacities they need, who do you see as kind of driving it at that kind of regional level? I mean, do we need greater subsidiarity on the island of Ireland, for Northern Ireland within the UK, for the regions within the Republic of Ireland, and then indeed in terms of those linkages between North Connacht and parts of Ulster, for example? I mean, maybe you take that first of all as a question or something to kind of respond to.
Sure. I think it's first of all, I think, do we need more subsidiarity on the island of Ireland? Absolutely, yes is the answer. Okay, both jurisdictions are amongst the most highly centralized in the state or in the world, as the OECD study of decentralization has pointed out, and indeed the Northern Western Regional Assembly in its regional agenda has called for a much more fundamental look at subsidiarity and devolution. So this is first point to make. Okay, the second point is absolutely there are different bodies that have different responsibilities, and so the departments we talked about in terms of, say, sectoral clustering, particularly at there are very good responsibilities at a jurisdiction level, and then the question is, I'm talking about Department of Infrastructure and Employment now, and Department for the Economy. Obviously, then, if there is to be an evolution of more all-island sectoral spokes, and they have a key role in that. Intertrade have a key role in that. Within the regions, clearly, there's the regional assemblies, the 3 regional assemblies. There is the various other bodies, Western Development Commission, for example, in the Northern Western region, and obviously then the development agencies, which have if you like, a national remit, have also got strong regional presence as well, and focus. So, and obviously the question is trying to deepen all that and work that. And also, I should also mention, I think the role of the universities, indeed, in the further training aspects is really critical in all this as well. So all of these groups at different levels have responsibilities and roles to play. And that goes back to Ellen Ostrom's work on polycentricity, because it is about bringing different groups together. It's not, there isn't going to be a blank sheet of, kind of replacing, everybody, every agency with a new, or every assembly or whatever, with a new structure as such. It's evolution and people working closer together on shared agendas and shared implementation programs. And that's where the polycentric approach and behavior and ability to actually work together across silos and at different levels comes into play. And that's, for me, is about evolving practice and culture that actually is the key to making this work.
Very good. And I should say, please, anyone, you can turn on your mic to ask a question for sure, or by all means do so in the chat function. And I see Donald Coffey says the body which should have been driving development in Central Border Region was ICBAN, but it has been largely absent since 2010. And John Feely says he's keen to develop the Sligo Leitrim concept. Just in terms of targets, then. Oh, sorry, I see a question from Stephen Roper, our hand up. Stephen, by all means, ask away.
Thanks, Tom. Niall, thank you very much. Most interesting sort of presentation. I hope you can hear me. I'm sort of in a strange environment at the moment. I thought the focus.
Good to talk to you again. In fact, I use some of your work in the context of the micros. So just to mention that.
I'm glad to hear it. I was going to say that the Northern Ireland Department had recently published a new survey of micro business innovation.
Okay.
A couple of months ago. So it bears out a lot of the messages that you were talking about. But the other thing I wanted to say was that we're doing a project at the moment with Queen's University and the Department for the Economy in the North, which is mapping the clusters across the island of Ireland. We've managed to geocode firms, the whole population of firms across the island. And we're doing some cluster mapping, looking at those looking at lots of different clusters, I think about 70 across the island, depending, and so just that might be a bit of a sort of foundational tool for taking this forward a little bit. We may be a month or so off publishing that yet, but when it does go live, I'm very happy to sort of circulate a link around and let people know that that's happening. It's not everything, but it does tell you where the firms doing certain activities will be located and co-located. And it is very interesting in terms of seeing some of the kind of cross-border corridors and connections that there are, particularly into the Northwest, but other regions as well. So I'll share a link to that whenever it's public, but we're not quite there yet.
Okay, no, thanks for that, Stephen. Yeah, no, that sounds very relevant and very important actually in terms of the mapping, up-to-date mapping. Yeah.
Yeah, Stephen, we'd be very, very excited to get that paper and see that research. I see there's a question in the chat from Donald Coffey. He's asking, or he's saying, the leading sectors you referenced in Northern Ireland are among least trade union friendly. You didn't mention any role for trade unions in the economic development process, and he asks, what role should trade unions have?
I think, I think they're quite central to it. I mean, when I talked about Sligo, the actual learning and nurturing, lifelong learning and nurturing culture. I think that is absolutely central, and I think both employers and unions have key roles to play in ensuring that happens. Both at number one and number two, obviously within companies as well. Like I think it's trying to develop win-wins for everybody, I think, within society that actually is key to progressing. And I think trade unions have a key role in that, yeah.
You referenced the Nordics a few times, and obviously you had the point about adult learning being key to the success of their model, and absolutely that's true. They've often been referenced as well in terms of the quality of their innovation systems. Do you feel that there's anything that we can learn from Denmark, Sweden, Finland in that regard?
Yes, I think, and two things. One is, I think, and this goes back to Lene Rachel Anderson's book, The Nordic Secret, okay? Because what she does basically is absolutely, it starts with adult education and human development back in the 1780s, right? And builds through the agricultural cooperative movement and so on. But it's also about, she calls it about, it's a story of a European story of beauty and freedom. And so the innovation bit of that is actually linked to the values of design and so on that they have encouraged and embedded, if you like, within the wider population through this very systematic approach to adult education, very widespread. And the second point, I think, is we are at a critical point in terms of our economic model, given the results of yesterday's election, I would have thought. And I think the learning from how Finland responded to the changes back in the 90s in terms of the USSR and so on, where they were exporting a huge amount into the USSR. And then they basically had to pivot and they doubled down on innovation. So they put innovation as the central approach to economic development, became the heart of their economic development. And I think there's certainly lessons to be learned from it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I suppose on that, obviously the Nordics invest a lot in public R&D, central to the innovation process. We don't do that here in the Republic of Ireland, at least. I found it interesting to note the number of the researcher ratio in Northern Ireland being as high as it is. Is that concentrated in particular sectors, or is it more broad?
Good question. The answer to which I don't know, but it's certainly one to be explored. And obviously location, are they mainly east of the Ban? Probably. So there's a kind of east-west across the island. There's an east-west tilt. And the question is, how can we balance that as distinct from, it's about reinforcing both and nurturing both, but it's east and west, but it's also how we balance it and make them complementary and contribute to each other. So there's further growth overall.
In terms of, you mentioned the Sligo-Enniskillen linkage potentially, but obviously we have Brexit now. Do you see that as being a significant barrier to the development of a regional cluster?
Well, I think the Centre for Cross-Border Studies has done a lot of work on Brexit, and particularly around movement of people and so on. And there are certainly some issues in that. But I think the overall regional clustering is more a matter of focus and complementarity and coordination, and sort of saying, okay, so what are we going to do to build this sector up to a greater level? So it's obviously, and it is cross-border work, which there's two jurisdictions and so on. But as there are 1 in 3 of Europe's European Union population live in border regions, and cross-border cooperation is commonplace. And in fact, in the slide on the life sciences clusters in Europe, there's actually the Danish-Swedish cross-border medtech cluster, which is a very significant cluster. So there's, it certainly is. It's a context and it's an aspect that we obviously need to take into account. But it's the key question is what's the opportunity? How can we build on it? And working through how can we build on it together for mutual benefit. For
sure. One of the big focus of the last European Commission, and probably this one too, will be the emphasis on the green and digital transitions. And obviously the economies of 2040, 2050 may look very, very significantly different from what they look like now. In terms of those two transitions, and I suppose just to pick two technologies, one from each, artificial intelligence in terms of the digital transformation, and I suppose renewable energy and the capacities that are there in the Northwest in terms of potentially wave energy, for example, but other renewables too, such as wind. To what extent do you think that there are opportunities there in terms of employment creation and in terms of the potential to develop any kind of a cluster? Seems perhaps a little bit ambitious in the first case for sure, but not everything is going to be about large language models, obviously. So, I mean, to what extent do you think we need to be thinking north and south of those type of opportunities in terms of the direction that employment will shift in the future, or are these things completely pie in the sky? Can they be achieved?
I think in both those sectors and industries and those technologies you mentioned, okay, I think clearly they are part of the economy of the future. So each region has to be part of that. Otherwise, they're going to be lagging regions. We're not part of the globally advancing sectors, then we will not be a region that is keeping up to pace. And I'm talking about any of the regions on the island. So I think it's key that that happens as part of the wider sectoral mix, if you like, okay? And then in terms of each of those, yes, so it's, quantum computing is not, we're not going to have a quantum computing center in each region, mind each town or wherever. So it has to be done on a proportionate basis. And so we could see, for example, in life sciences, you've got life sciences, we have an overall life sciences significant spoke emerging within each region. Then we have medtech and so on, as we talked about earlier. And then with each town or sub-region, NUTS 2 region or Sligo Leitrim or whatever it is, there's a component of that actually feeds into. So it's all about a question, I think, of networks, hubs, spokes, and spokes to spokes, and so forth. Okay, and actually connecting within that network, both on the island and, of course, globally into the UK, into European Union, into and other parts of the world.
Very good. And of course, everyone feel free to ask questions as well. One I was particularly curious about, and maybe I missed it as you were going through the slide, was in terms of the competitiveness scorecard. Do you know why Northern Ireland booked the trend between 2017 and 2021?
The answer to that is I don't. I suspect sectoral focus is clustering is one aspect of it. Their 10x strategy has certainly allowed certain investments to go into some key sectors. Now, obviously, there are other factors, I'm sure. So I don't actually know the answer to that, but it's certainly one that is useful to kind of to understand further.
I suppose a final question for me then is that if you were advising Stormont or Dublin for that matter, in terms of what is the piece of the puzzle that we're missing, to the extent that we are missing anything, and of course we might not be, but what are the things that we're not doing that we ought to be doing? What are the key failures in terms of policy, as you would see it?
I think that first of all, I think there's already discussions on all island sectoral clustering, and I think that's a key to actually progressing that as a key all island discussion that is very important. I think then the other part of it, I think, is the whole area of education, particularly further education, as well, of course, as higher education. But then working together, and particularly with enterprises. I think that whole area of adult, the transformation of our workplaces and of the skills that our adult population has, as well, of course, a full education system is absolutely critical. And again, there's a lot of work going on in it and a lot of progress, but it's, for me, they're the two that I kind of think of. Obviously, physical infrastructure is critical. The N17 is kind of narrows very dangerously at parts, and it's not, so this if we're going to have a series of cities along the west coast, we need to have a serious road system that connects it as well as a rail system, and so on. So there's a number of key factors, but there's work going on.
Very good. Noel Cahill asks, or states, the NPF has ambitious targets for faster population growth in the cities other than Dublin. Is there a need for more alignment between population targets which guide spatial planning and regional development policy to drive regional employment?
Yeah, is the answer. I mean, but I think it comes back to spatial hierarchy, okay, and trying to understand how each level interacts with each, the other levels, and also how you enrich each level so that that each place has a contribution to make. And I think that is central to the regional development, because each region is structured differently from a spatial point of view. And like, for example, in the Northern Western region, there's a very significant share of rural locations, completely different than if you look at a map of highly rural locations on the island of Ireland. They're almost all clustered in the Northern Western region, Kerry in addition. But I think it's specific in terms of its contribution, of how you link the two. Yeah. Can I mention just one thing before we finish?
Of course.
Oh, sorry. I do just on ICBAN. ICBAN is still in existence, just to say, and is actually doing some work on renewing their regional strategy and so on. So just to as a point of information, I'm sure that the contributor knows more about it than I do, but just to mention, I do know they're actually still there.
Very good. Important clarification. So look, once again, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to do this. It's an extremely useful resource for us. And I know there are people, certainly within the broader labour movement, who'll be looking at this very closely and using it as inspiration for some of our own work as well, and the advice that we give, both North and South. And so I very much thank you for that. Before we do go, I'd just like to mention again that we do have one more event before the end of the year, which will be our Donal Nevin lecture, which will be in the Royal Irish Academy on the 5th of December at 6 p.m. And Professor Mary Murphy will present on a new all-island social settlement, an eco-social future of care and equality, with Dr. Larry O'Connell from NESC as the respondent, and it will be followed by the book launch of Studies, an Irish Quarterly Review. And just to note as well that Stephen Roper has put up a link to a microbusiness innovation report, and of course that'll be up once we have this up on the web. You'll be able to see that link as well there.
Great, thanks, Stephen.
Hopefully. So without further ado, I will let you go, Niall, and thank you once again, and I'm sure we'll be in conversation with each other very, very soon, and hopefully I'll see you in December at our lecture.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye,
thanks
everybody.
for